She knocked out the most dangerous crime lord in the city. With her bare hands, no weapon, no backup, just an exhausted waitress on a midnight shift who refused to kneel. And that single moment of defiance? It didn't free her. It made her his prisoner. What happens next will cost her everything she ever loved, and force her to choose between the life she built and the man she was never supposed to trust. Drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because this is only the beginning. The rain came in hard around 11:15, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack. Sideways sheets of it, hammering the windows of Evelyn's Cross's diner like it had a personal grudge. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours. Her lower back had stopped aching somewhere around hour 6 and gone completely numb, which she'd learned to count as a mercy. The coffee maker on the far end of the counter had been dripping wrong for 3 days, leaving a brown stain on the tile that no amount of scrubbing seemed to touch. The fluorescent light above booth 4 flickered every 40 seconds, and she'd counted those flickers so many times she no longer noticed she was doing it. The diner was called Patty's, though nobody named Patty had owned it in 15 years. The current owner, a man named Gerald who smelled perpetually of cigarettes and broken promises, showed up twice a week to collect the register totals and complain about the cost of napkins. He'd hired Evelyn 3 years ago because she never called in sick and never argued about tips. Both things were still true. Neither had ever felt like a virtue. She was wiping down the counter when the door opened. The bell above it chimed, that cheap, thin little sound, and 3 men walked in out of the rain like they'd simply decided the storm didn't apply to them. The first 2 she clocked immediately as trouble. Big, tailored coats that cost more than her monthly rent, eyes that moved around the room the way predators' eyes move, not looking at things but cataloging them. One of them was already scanning the booze, the kitchen window, the back exit. The other had his right hand inside his coat, resting, not reaching, just resting. The third man walked between them. He wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the widest. In another setting, in different clothes, you might have walked past him without slowing down. But there was something about the way he moved through space, like space itself had already arranged to accommodate him before he arrived. He wore a dark suit with the collar open, no tie, rainwater beating off the fabric like it didn't dare soak in. His face was composed in the particular way of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything the world offered. He looked at the room once. Then he looked at Evelyn. She didn't look away. She should have. And somewhere in the back of her mind she knew she should have. But she was tired and her feet hurt, and something about the deliberate weight of his gaze made her jaw set instead of soften. "Sit anywhere," she said. Her voice was flat, informational. The man with his hand inside his coat stepped slightly forward, and she watched the third man, the one who mattered. She understood that now without being told, raise 2 fingers without looking at him. The bodyguard stopped. He walked to the counter instead of a booth, sat down directly in front of her. His eyes were dark, a gray so deep it read as charcoal in the bad fluorescent light, and they held that specific quality of total attention, the kind that usually made people start talking to fill the silence. Evelyn didn't fill the silence. "Coffee," he said. "We have regular and burnt," she said. "The burnt is technically the same as the regular. I'm just being honest about it." Something moved in his face. Not a smile. More like the ghost of one that had been considering the possibility and then decided against it. "Regular," he said. She poured it, set the mug down without ceremony, turned back to her rag and the counter. "You're not curious," he said. "About what?" "About who I am." She wrung out the rag over the small sink below the counter, keeping her back mostly to him. "You're someone who walked in out of the rain and ordered coffee. That's as curious as I need to get at 11:30 on a Thursday." The flickering light above booth 4 did its thing. Outside, thunder worked its way across the sky in a long, low roll. "My name is Lucien Moreau." Evelyn turned around. She looked at him the way you look at someone who's just told you something they clearly believe is supposed to change your behavior. "Evelyn Cross," she said. "You want cream?" The bodyguard nearest the door made a sound that might have been a cough or a laugh being murdered before it fully formed. Lucien Moreau. And she did know the name, knew it the way everyone in this city knew it, attached to stories you didn't repeat in well-lit places. Looked at her for a long moment. "No cream," he said. The next 40 minutes were strange in the way of things that feel ordinary from the outside and wrong from the inside. Two other customers filtered out into the rain, a trucker who'd been nursing pie for an hour, and a college kid who took one look at the men by the door and left $3 on the table before the check arrived. Evelyn refilled Lucian's coffee twice without being asked. He didn't look at his phone, he didn't speak to his men. He sat with his hands around the mug and watched the rain streak down the window glass. She didn't ask him what he was doing in a place like this at a time like this. She'd worked the overnight long enough to know that people who came to diners at midnight were usually running from something or towards something, and neither category required her participation. At 1:45, the kitchen phone rang. She picked it up at the back counter, turned away from the room. It was Danny, her brother. She could tell from the way he said her name in the first half second, the particular texture of it, the way it went slightly upward at the end, that something was wrong. "Hey," she said. "What's wrong?" Ev." He stopped. She heard him drag in a breath. "The financial aid got cut. The university sent an email today. There was some clerical thing with the disbursement form from last semester. They're saying I owe..." "How much?" "Danny, how much?" The number he said took 3 seconds to land properly. When it did, she turned and put her free hand on the counter to keep herself from moving, from doing something with the feeling that had just collapsed behind her sternum. "Okay," she said. "I can take a semester off. You're not taking a semester off. I'll figure it out." "You always say that." "Because I always do." She said it without heat, which was the only way she knew how to mean it. "Go to sleep. I'll call you tomorrow." She hung up the phone. When she turned back around, Lucien Moreau was watching her. "Problem?" he said. "Part of the job," she said, and went back to the counter. She was refilling the napkin dispensers when he spoke again, and what he said next pulled her attention fully, completely, the way something can when it is both unexpected and precisely calibrated to wound. "You're working yourself to exhaustion," he said, "to pay for someone else's life, and you do it because no one else will." She set the napkin dispenser down, looked at him. "You've been listening to my phone call. I've been sitting 4 feet away." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "but it's true." She pulled herself to her full height, which was not impressive by most standards, but felt, in that moment, sufficient. "You want to know something about yourself, Mr. Moreau? The fact that you think being observant makes you interesting is the most predictable thing about you. Rich men who run things always think watching other people makes them wise. It doesn't. It just makes them voyeurs with better furniture." The silence that followed was not comfortable. The bodyguard by the door had stopped being still. Evelyn could feel the shift in the room's attention, the way the air pressure in a space changes when something dangerous decides it's paying closer attention. Lucien Moreau turned the mug slowly in his hands. Once. Twice. His expression had not changed, but the quality of it had. The way a fire that looked contained can look different when you realize the container has a crack. "You should be careful," he said, "about who you speak to that way." "You came into my diner," she said, "at midnight, in the rain, without being invited. You want respect, you can earn it the way everybody else does. You tip 20%, you don't leave a mess, and you keep your observations about my personal life to yourself." And then he did the thing she would replay in different versions for months afterward. He reached into his jacket, slowly enough that she watched him do it, and understood it was deliberate, the slowness itself a kind of performance. He withdrew an envelope, thick and white, and set it on the counter between them. Not sliding it, setting it, the way you'd place something on an altar. "For your brother," he said. "Cover his tuition, and whatever else." She looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. "Take it back," she said. "It's already yours." "Take it back. Consider it..." She picked up the envelope, and she tore it in half. Then she tore the halves in half again. Bills, real, physical bills, not a check, not a transfer, cash, fluttered from the torn edges onto the counter. She gathered them, tore them again, and pushed the entire mess across the counter toward him. "I don't know what you're used to," she said, "but I'm not something you purchase." The bodyguard with his hand inside his coat had taken 3 steps forward. The other one was moving to flank the counter. Lucien had not moved. He looked at the torn money. Then he looked at her. That was $4,000, he said. Looked like about $4,000, yeah. Something happened to his face then. Something she couldn't fully name. Not anger, though anger was underneath it. Something more like a door opening that he'd forgotten had a hinge. Nobody, he said carefully, has ever done that. I find that hard to believe. You shouldn't. He paused. I want to know why. Because I don't want your money. She met his eyes. Because I don't want anything from you. That should be simple enough. He stood up. He was taller standing than he'd appeared sitting, and she made herself stay exactly where she was because moving back even 1 inch felt like the wrong kind of answer. I'm going to have to insist, he said, that you come with us. I'm in the middle of a shift. Your shift is over. I don't... Evelyn. He said her name, which she hadn't given him, with a quietness that landed harder than shouting. My men are going to take you to the car. You can walk or they can carry you. Either way, you're coming. I'd prefer the version where you choose. She looked at the 2 men moving toward her. She looked at the door. She looked at Lucien Moreau. This is kidnapping, she said. Yes, he said. The honesty of it hit her like a wall. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She grabbed the brass napkin holder from the end of the counter, heavy, solid, the kind they didn't make anymore. And when the first bodyguard reached for her arm, she swung it. She caught him across the side of the face, and he went sideways into the booth, and in the 2 seconds of chaos that created, she turned and went for the back door. She almost made it. Almost. The second man caught her at the door to the kitchen, and even as she fought, and she did fight, elbows and feet and everything she had, she felt the grip and knew it was over. Not because she'd given up, because mathematics didn't care about will. They brought her back to the front of the diner, both men rougher now, less careful. Lucien was still standing at the counter. He was looking at the unconscious bodyguard, then at Evelyn, and then, with the particular expression of someone solving an equation and disliking the elegance of the answer, he walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away. You hit Marcus, he said. He reached for me first. He's been in my service for 11 years. Then he should have known better. Lucien looked at her for a long time, long enough that she cataloged the signs of what was about to happen and decided she wouldn't look away from any of them. Then he reached out and took her chin in one hand, not hard, but definite, the way you'd reposition a painting that was slightly crooked, and tilted her face upward. You should be terrified, he said. I'm furious, she said. It's different. He held her gaze, then he released her, took 1 step back. Bring her, he said to his remaining man. And then Marcus, rising from the booth with blood on his temple and murder in his eyes, reached past his boss and slapped her, open-handed, the crack of it filling the diner, her head snapping to the side. Evelyn felt the impact, felt the ringing start, felt the burn climbing the side of her face. She turned back, and before anyone in the room had fully processed what was happening, before the shock of Marcus's action had finished rippling through the space, Evelyn Cross pulled her arm back and hit Lucien Moreau, who was standing directly in front of her, who was the wrong man, who she hit anyway out of pure, white, uncalculating rage, with every ounce of force she had in her body. The crack of her fist connecting with his jaw was loud in the small space. Lucien Moreau, the untouchable, the feared, the man whose name cleared rooms and whose gaze made grown criminals find somewhere else to be, dropped like a stone. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining bodyguard looked at his unconscious employer on the floor of a diner, looked at Evelyn, her fist still raised, her chest heaving, the red mark of Marcus's slap burning on her cheek. Then Marcus, the one she'd already hit with the napkin holder, looked at the bodyguard. Kill her, Marcus said. The bodyguard raised his weapon. Evelyn closed her eyes. And then from the floor, barely above a whisper, she heard a voice. Don't. She opened her eyes. Lucien Moreau was on one elbow on the linoleum floor of a roadside diner, blood at the corner of his mouth, staring up at her with an expression she had absolutely no architecture for. He was laughing, not performing it, not using it. Actually laughing, low and genuine and fractured, like something that had been locked behind his ribs for a very long time and had finally found an exit. He looked at the bodyguard. Put it down. Sir, put it down. He looked at Marcus. And you. His voice went cold so fast it was like watching water freeze. We'll discuss what you just did. Then he looked at Evelyn, and in his eyes, beneath the amusement, beneath the blood, beneath the calculation that never fully left, she saw something she would spend the next 6 months trying to name. He stood up slowly, straightened his suit, touched the corner of his mouth with 2 fingers, and looked at the blood. You hit me, he said. You had it coming. Nobody has ever hit me. Now somebody has. He nodded, slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd been theorizing. You're still coming with me, he said. I know, she said, because she did know. That part hadn't changed. What had changed, what she couldn't have named then and would understand only later, much later, in the dark of a room in a mansion she'd never wanted to enter, was that she was no longer just a problem to be managed. She had become something else entirely. She just didn't know yet what that cost. Outside, the rain had not stopped. The car waiting at the curb was dark and long and said nothing about where it was going. Evelyn Cross walked toward it on her own feet, the slap still burning on her cheek, the knowledge of Danny's tuition bill sitting like a stone in the center of her chest, and the sound of a dangerous man's laughter still echoing in the back of her skull like something that hadn't finished with her yet. The door closed. The diner fell away behind her, and Patty's, with its burnt coffee and its flickering light and its torn bills scattered across the counter, went dark. The car smelled like leather and money, and the particular kind of silence that isn't peaceful, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on your sternum and makes it harder to breathe than it should be. Evelyn sat in the back seat between 2 men who said nothing. Lucien sat across from her, facing backward, a small bar of ambient light from the city cutting across his jaw where she'd hit him. The bruise hadn't formed yet, but it would. She could already see the swelling starting at the corner of his mouth, the faint discoloration climbing toward his cheekbone, and some part of her that she wasn't proud of felt a grim, small satisfaction at the sight of it. He was watching her the way you watch something you've decided to understand. She looked out the window instead. The city moved past in wet streaks. Streetlights, storefronts with their gates pulled down. The occasional figure hunched under an awning. She tried to track the route, count the turns, build a mental map. Left off the main boulevard, then north for maybe 6 minutes, then onto a road she didn't recognize where the buildings got farther apart and the light got thinner. She lost confidence in the map somewhere around the 4th turn. You're counting, Lucien said. She didn't answer. Turns, he said. You've been counting turns since we left. You want to know where you are? I want to know a lot of things. Ask. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. Why am I still alive? He considered that for a moment like it was a reasonable question deserving a considered answer, which somehow made it worse. Because you interest me, he said. That's not a reason. That's an appetite. Maybe. He reached up and touched the corner of his jaw, lightly, testing the tenderness. You hit harder than most men I know. I was aiming for Marcus. I know. You stepped in front of him. I know that too. The car turned again, and she gave up on the map entirely. Outside, the last of the city's ambient glow faded, and the road became dark and private, lined with trees that pressed close enough that the headlights threw moving shadows across the interior of the car. My brother, she said. What about him? He doesn't know where I am. He'll try to call the diner when his shift ends. She stopped, recalibrated. He'll panic. He won't know anything's wrong. How would you know that? Lucien didn't answer, and the silence itself was an answer, and the shape of that answer made the hairs on the back of her arms stand up. She looked at him with new attention. What did you do? She said. Nothing yet. That word yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The ghost of something moved across his face. Your brother's name is Daniel. He's a junior at Caldwell University. He's studying civil engineering. He gets mostly B's with occasional A's in structural analysis, which is the only subject that actually interests him. He lives off campus with 2 roommates. He calls you every Thursday and most Sundays. He doesn't know what you do to make sure those calls are possible. The air in the car felt different, thinner. If you touch him, I'm not going to touch him. He said it simply, without reassurance, which was somehow more convincing than if he'd worked to comfort her. He's of no use to me. And I am. Yes. What use? He looked at her for a long moment without answering. The car slowed, turned through a gate. She heard the mechanical movement of it, the guard's voice a low murmur outside. And then they were on a private road, gravel under the tires now, and ahead she could see lights. The mansion was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. It was large without being ostentatious, the kind of architecture that communicated wealth not by shouting, but by simply existing in the most solid and permanent way possible. Stone and dark glass, and a facade that showed nothing of what was inside. Floodlights illuminated the grounds in a flat, colorless wash that made everything look slightly unreal. The car stopped. A man opened her door from the outside. She didn't move immediately, and no one forced her to, which was its own kind of message. She got out. The rain had softened to something between mist and drizzle, and the night air was cold in a way that cut through her uniform. Thin cotton, a polyester apron she was still wearing, which struck her suddenly as absurd. She was standing in front of a criminal's fortress in an apron that still had a coffee stain on the front pocket. Lucienne came around the car and walked toward the entrance without looking back to see if she followed. The two men who'd been in the back seat positioned themselves behind her, not touching, just present. She followed. Inside was warmth and the smell of old wood and something that might have been expensive candles. The entry hall was high-ceilinged, marble-floored, lit by fixtures that gave off a warm, amber light that felt deliberately unlike the outside world. A staircase rose on the right. Corridors extended left and straight ahead. A man in a dark suit stood at the intersection of the corridors and nodded at Lucienne without speaking. Lucienne stopped in the entry hall and turned to face her. "You'll have a room," he said. "It locks from the inside. The windows are— Don't try the windows. There are clothes. If they're wrong, you can say so. Someone will bring food. I want to go home. I know. I'm telling you, not asking. I know that too." His eyes moved over her face, over the mark still burning on her cheek where Marcus had hit her, and something in his expression shifted minutely. "That's going to be dealt with," he said. "I don't need you to deal with it." It wasn't an offer. He turned and walked deeper into the house, and a woman appeared from somewhere. Staff, by her manner, efficient and expressionless, and gestured for Evelyn to follow her up the staircase. Evelyn stood still for 3 full seconds, which was the exact amount of time it took her to calculate whether there was any viable alternative. There wasn't. She followed the woman up the stairs. The room was on the 2nd floor at the end of a corridor. It was larger than her apartment. The bed was the kind that made her own look like a camping cot, all dark linen and actual pillows. There was a wardrobe with clothes already inside, which meant this room had been prepared for someone, though whether for her specifically or for this category of situation in general, she didn't want to think about too hard. A bathroom, no phone, no computer, no clock, which felt intentional and cruel. The window was tall and faced the grounds. She checked it anyway, because she had to. It was sealed in a way that wasn't obvious from the inside. It looked like a normal window. It had a latch. The latch moved. But when she pressed on the glass, it didn't flex the way glass should. Reinforced, probably laminated, the kind that didn't break when you hit it. She pressed harder to confirm. It held. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still in her uniform. She thought about Danny. She thought about the number he'd said on the phone. She thought about the torn bills scattered across the counter at Patty's, and the particular satisfaction of tearing them, and the way that satisfaction sat next to the reality of her situation, the way two things that shouldn't coexist sometimes have to anyway. She was still sitting there, upright, uniform on, apron still tied, when the light through the window changed and she understood that she'd been in the room for hours without noticing. She hadn't slept. She wasn't sure she could. The knock on the door came at what felt like early morning, though the light outside was still gray and gave nothing away. She said nothing, and a woman entered anyway, different from the one the night before, this one younger, carrying a tray with food that was dramatically out of proportion to Evelyn's expectations. Actual food. Eggs, toast, coffee in a real cup, orange juice. She set it on the small table near the window without speaking. "Is there a schedule?" Evelyn asked. "Or is this just random appearances?" The woman looked at her with the neutral expression of someone who'd been specifically trained not to have opinions. "Mr. Moreau would like to see you at 9, she said. "Downstairs." "And if I'd prefer not to?" The woman said nothing, which was its own complete answer. Evelyn ate because she was hungry, and being hungry wasn't going to help anything, and she changed out of her uniform because wearing it another hour was going to make her feel crazy. The clothes in the wardrobe were expensive and generic, and fit her well enough to be uncomfortable in that way, where you realize someone has had you measured somehow. She chose the plainest option, dark pants, a gray top that asked nothing of her, and went downstairs at 9:05 because being exactly on time felt like compliance, and she needed to be at least something. Lucien was in a room off the main corridor that was more office than sitting room, bookshelves along two walls, a desk that he wasn't sitting at, an arrangement of chairs near a window that looked out onto a garden, wet and gray in the morning. He was in different clothes, casual by his standards, still a dress shirt but no jacket, and there was coffee on the table between the chairs. He was standing when she came in, which might have been courtesy or might have been strategy, and she filed it away without deciding which. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself?" He sat, crossing one leg, and poured coffee into the second cup like she hadn't said anything. She stood for about 30 seconds before her back reminded her she'd been awake all night, and she sat down. He didn't comment on it. She gave him points for that. "Last night," he said, "you asked what use you are to me. You didn't answer. I'm answering now." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I have 41 people in this organization. I've known most of them for over a decade. I trust none of them completely. Not because they're incompetent, because everyone in my world has a stake, an angle, a reason to tell me what I want to hear rather than what's true." He paused. "In 40 minutes in a roadside diner, you told me 4 things that were unflattering, accurate, and completely unnecessary for your own survival. That's not something I encounter. You want a yes man, hire a yes man. I have 30 of them. They're useless." He looked at her over his cup. "I want someone who tells me when I'm wrong. You kidnapped me to be your conscience. I prefer to think of it as a consulting arrangement. I don't consent to arrangements I'm kidnapped into." "No," he said. "You don't. That's exactly the problem and exactly the point." He set his cup down. "You can hate me for bringing you here. You're entitled to that. But while you're here, you will be treated with respect by everyone in this house. You'll want for nothing materially, and you won't be asked to do anything that violates—" He paused, choosing the word. "Your sense of yourself." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. "You talk like someone who's read a lot of books about how to be decent without ever actually practicing it." He absorbed that without visible reaction. "Possibly. What happens to me if I keep refusing to cooperate? You stay here. Indefinitely. Until I'm satisfied you're not a liability. And if I am?" He met her eyes. "Then we have a different conversation." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the distant sound of activity elsewhere in the house. Footsteps, a door, voices that cut off before becoming words. She drank the coffee because it was in front of her and it was good, and she was exhausted, and she hated herself slightly for both reasons. 3 days passed in a strange, pressurized rhythm. She was not locked in her room. She could move through most of the house. The ground floor, the garden when the weather permitted, the kitchen where the staff treated her with the polite wariness of people who didn't know which category she occupied and didn't want to guess wrong. She couldn't leave the grounds. She tested that boundary the first afternoon, walking toward the gate with measured steps, watching the 2 men who materialized at the edges of her vision without hurrying. She stopped before they reached her, turned around, walked back. There was nothing to be gained from the confirmation, and she already had it. She and Lucien ate dinner together each evening in a dining room that was too large for 2 people and had the ambiance of a place used to having more. He asked her questions, not about herself, not in the way that would have felt invasive, but about things. What she thought about a news item, how she'd have handled a specific business problem he described in abstract terms, what she made of a particular kind of loyalty. She answered or didn't, depending on whether the question offended her, and he never pushed when she didn't. On the 4th night, she asked him a question. "The man from last night," she said, "the one who came for dinner." He'd had guests, men in suits with careful faces, and she'd eaten separately, which she'd preferred, but she'd seen them arrive and seen the quality of the tension that came in with them. Lucien looked up from his plate. "Darren's. He was lying to you." Silence. "About what?" "About the warehouse numbers. He cited a figure twice, same number both times, exactly the same. People don't remember figures that precisely unless they've rehearsed them. She picked up her glass, and he looked at his phone twice during the meal, both times right before he spoke. He was checking something, notes maybe, or a message telling him what to say. Lucien had gone very still. "You were watching," he said. "I was eating dinner in your kitchen with a window to the garden, and your dining room has glass doors. I wasn't trying to watch, but you saw it. I see things. I've worked service jobs for 6 years. You watch people, you learn how to read them." She set her glass down. "Do with that what you want." He didn't say anything for the rest of the meal. The next morning, Darren's had not come back. She didn't ask what had happened to him, and Lucien didn't tell her, but the quality of the house changed slightly. A tautness in the staff, an extra man near the front entrance, a phone call she could hear Lucien taking in the corridor, his voice flat and quiet in the way that was worse than anger. The morning after that, Gavin Rourke arrived. She'd heard the name in pieces, from conversations she wasn't meant to overhear, from the way other people's posture changed when it was mentioned. He was Lucien's lieutenant, the operational one, the man who ran the day-to-day mechanics of things she didn't let herself name too directly. He was tall, built with a heaviness that was more will than genetics, with a face that had stopped being young before the rest of him had caught up. He wore his authority like a physical object, carried it out in front, made you acknowledge it before you got to him. He walked into the sitting room where Evelyn was reading. She'd found books. The shelves were genuinely used, and she'd decided that was one point in Lucien's favor, and then immediately resented giving him any. And he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her with a quality of attention that was not Lucien's. Lucien's attention had been interested, engaged, something that could theoretically be negotiated with. Gavin Rourke's attention was the other kind, the kind that was already calculating. "You're the waitress," he said. She put her finger on the page to mark her place. "I'm Evelyn." "Right." He came into the room without being invited, took the chair across from her, Lucien's chair, she'd come to think of it without meaning to, and sat with the ease of someone who sat wherever he wanted in this house. "How long you been here?" 5 days. "Comfortable?" "Not particularly." "No." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't travel all the way to its destination. "I imagine not." He looked around the room, at the book in her hand, at the coffee on the side table, at the general arrangement of her presence in the space. "Lucien treating you well?" "Depends on your definition. He hasn't hurt you." "He kidnapped me." He said it like she'd offered a mildly interesting data point. "He does things his own way. Always has." He looked back at her. "You're not what I expected." "People keep saying that." "No, they don't." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and the shift in his posture changed the atmosphere of the room the way a barometric drop changes the feel of air before a storm. "I'm going to be honest with you, Evelyn. Can I call you Evelyn?" "You already are." "Lucien is—" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "He's been under a lot of pressure. He makes decisions that I sometimes need to course correct. That's my job." He paused. "You being here is one of those decisions. Then take it up with him." "I'm taking it up with you." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing dramatic. I'm suggesting that whatever dynamic you two have developed, whatever connection he thinks he's found, it would be better for everyone, including you, if it stayed simple. If you stayed simple." "You want me to be less interesting. I want you to be smart." He said it without raising his voice, which was its own kind of pressure. "Smart enough to understand that you're in a house full of people whose lives are complicated in ways you cannot protect yourself from, and that the safest thing you can do is remind Lucien that you're a temporary arrangement, not a permanent fixture." She closed the book, set it on the table beside her coffee. "Let me make sure I understand what's happening here. You came into this room, sat in a chair you weren't invited to sit in, and told me to make myself smaller because I'm making you nervous." His eyes went flat, just for a moment. "I'm not nervous. You're here, aren't you?" She kept her voice even, the way she'd kept it even across the counter from difficult customers for years, which was its own education. "If I wasn't a problem, you wouldn't have introduced yourself." He stood up slowly. You should be careful about reading situations, he said. You might misread one. I might, she said, but I haven't yet. He looked at her for a moment that went on just long enough to be deliberate. Then he walked out of the room. She didn't move for a full minute after he left. Her hands, she noticed when she looked down at them, were completely steady, which surprised her. What was happening inside her chest was something different, a tight, high-frequency hum of something between fear and fury that she didn't have a clean word for. She understood now that she'd made an enemy, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd done something right. And in this world, she was beginning to understand those were the same. She picked up the book, put her finger back on the page, read the same sentence 4 times without it going anywhere useful. That evening, Lucien came to find her in the garden, the first time he'd sought her out rather than waiting for their structured dinner. And she was sitting on a stone bench at the far end, watching the grounds, counting the patrol pattern of the men she could see because old habits didn't care about context. Gavin spoke to you, he said. Not a question. This morning. He sat down on the other end of the bench without asking. What did he say? He suggested I manage your expectations of me. She looked at a light moving along the far tree line, a flashlight, a guard on a perimeter sweep. He was polite about it. That was the part that was supposed to be reassuring and wasn't. Lucien was quiet. He's your second, she said. He thinks I'm destabilizing something. Are you? She looked at him. I think the thing that's being destabilized was already unstable. I'm just the thing that made it visible. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, across the garden, toward the wall and the dark beyond it. The angle of his face in the light from the house made him look temporarily less armored than usual. Something she'd noticed happened to people when they faced slightly away from you, when they thought they were being observed less directly. Darren's was skimming, he said. 3 years. The figure he cited was the cover number, not the real one. You were right. I know. You knew you were right when you said it. Yes. And you said it anyway. You asked me to tell you when you were wrong. She looked back at the guard's light moving through the trees. Seemed like the applicable moment. The silence between them was different from earlier silences, less adversarial, more like the kind that accumulates between people who've established something they haven't named yet. My father built this organization, Lucien said. He said it the way people say things they've said to themselves many times and almost never out loud. He built it by making people believe 2 things simultaneously, that he was generous and that you did not want to find out what he was like when he wasn't. He paused. I inherited both the organization and the method. And now you're not sure the method works. The method works. He said it with the precision of a man who has no confusion on this point. It just creates certain maintenance problems. Like Darren's. Like Darren's. She understood then that she was sitting in a garden at night with a man who ran a criminal organization and speaking to him like he was a person with a complicated situation, which he was, and that the distance between understanding someone and approving of them was the distance she needed to maintain and was already having trouble measuring. She stood up from the bench. I want to call my brother, she said. Lucien looked up at her. No. He'll know something's wrong. I've taken care of that. She stared at him. What does that mean? It means he received a message from your number explaining that you've taken an unplanned trip, a family situation out of state. He texted back that he hoped everything was okay. He met her eyes. He seemed to believe it. The thing that moved through her then was not one emotion but several arriving simultaneously and refusing to organize themselves neatly. You used my phone. I had someone send a message from your phone, yes. While I was... She stopped. Started again. While I was in this house, someone pretended to be me to my brother. To protect him from... Don't! The word came out with a force that surprised her and didn't surprise her. Don't tell me it was to protect him. You did it to keep him from asking questions. You did it because a brother looking for a missing sister is an inconvenience. She felt her voice thinning, which happened when the feeling beneath it got too large for the words to fully contain. He's 20 years old and he's worried about money and his sister just... She stopped again, breathed. He thinks I'm fine. He does think you're fine, Lucien said, which means he can focus on his studies and not, you don't get to decide what's good for my brother. She said it quietly and it landed harder for the quiet. You have taken a lot of things from me in the last 5 days. You don't get to take my right to be honest with the one person in this world I'm actually responsible for." Lucian stood up from the bench. He was taller than her and closer now than he'd been, and she didn't move back because moving back was not a direction she'd been able to go comfortably for a very long time. "You'll get your phone," he said, "when I'm confident you won't do something that puts you in more danger than you're already in." "More danger than—" She laughed, and it was not a happy sound. "I'm in your house. I'm surrounded by armed men. Your lieutenant came to my room this morning to suggest I make myself smaller. What exactly is the danger you're protecting me from?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his jaw. The bruise she'd put there, still faintly visible, flexing as he worked whatever he was deciding not to say. "Gavin came to see you this morning," he said. "I told you that." "You didn't tell me he came to your room. I said the sitting room." "You said my room." She replayed the sentence. She had. A slip, the way language ran ahead of you when you were tired. "The sitting room," she corrected. "Evelyn." His voice had a different quality now, careful in the way of someone placing each word with intention. "What exactly did he say to you?" She told him, precisely because she was good at precise recall and because she understood instinctively that precision mattered here. She watched his face as she spoke and cataloged the changes in it. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold, very focused attention that was worse than anger in the way that things that are controlled are sometimes more dangerous than things that aren't. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means go inside, get some sleep." He looked past her toward the house, and the quality of whatever he was calculating was something she understood she wasn't meant to see, but was seeing anyway. "Tomorrow is going to be a longer day." "Lucien." She used his name deliberately, the first time she'd done it, and watched the small register of it in his face. "Is Gavin going to be a problem for me?" He looked at her for a moment. For once, he didn't answer immediately. "Not yet," he said. It was the most frightening thing he'd said to her since the night he told her she was coming with him, and what made it frightening was not its content but the honest, almost tired way he said it, the way you say something that's true and that you haven't finished deciding what to do about. She went inside. She lay in the dark of the room that was not hers and stared at the ceiling and thought about Danny and the message sent from her phone and the particular look on Gavin Rourke's face when she'd told him she hadn't misread anything yet. She thought about Lucien's voice in the garden saying "not yet" in a tone that meant sooner than you think. She thought about the fact that in 6 days she had gone from being someone who tore up $4,000 to being someone who had exposed an embezzler and made an enemy of a lieutenant and watched the bruise on a crime lord's jaw with more attention than was wise, and that the trajectory of this, wherever it was going, had a momentum that she could feel in the way you feel a current in water before you can see it pulling. She was not safe here. But she had begun, against every reasonable instruction her own mind was giving her, to understand the specific shape of the danger. And there was something in that understanding that felt, dangerously, a little like control. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would learn that 3 of Lucien's men had been found dead at the perimeter of the property, that the surveillance feed covering the east gate had been looped for 40 minutes the night before, and that someone had been inside the house who was not supposed to be there, and that the only thing between what had happened and something catastrophic was the fact that whoever had come had not yet found what they were looking for. Or who? She heard them before she saw them. It was the sound that woke her. Not loud, which was exactly why it registered. A lifetime of light sleeping, of keeping one ear tuned to the frequency of things that shouldn't be happening, had rewired something in her that no amount of exhaustion could fully shut down. The sound was wrong in the specific way of a house that had a rhythm and was suddenly off it. A door. A voice cut short. A silence that arrived too quickly after a sound and stayed too long. She was sitting upright in the dark before she'd fully decided to be. 3 seconds of listening told her enough. Movement in the corridor. More than one person. The particular quality of footsteps that were trying not to be footsteps and failing in the marginal, almost invisible way that trained people fail at things they're rushing. She didn't turn on the light. She found her shoes in the dark by feel, put them on, stood up. The room had one door and the window she already knew wouldn't break. She went to the door and put her hand flat on it without touching the handle and felt nothing. No vibration, no shadow at the gap at the bottom blocking the light from the corridor. She opened it fast. The corridor was not empty. There were two men at the far end she didn't recognize, and one man she did. One of Lucien's staff, a security detail she'd seen on the ground floor rotation, and he was on the floor, not moving. The two unfamiliar men were moving away from him toward the staircase. One of them looked back when her door opened. She shut the door and locked it from the inside in the same motion, the deadbolt throwing with a sound that felt very loud and probably wasn't. Then she stood in this dark room and thought, very quickly, about the layout of the second floor. The staircase was at the end of the corridor to the left. The men were between her and the staircase. There was a second staircase at the opposite end of the house. She'd seen it on the third day, a narrower one, staff access probably, behind a door that looked like a wall panel because the wood grain matched and you only noticed if you were looking. She'd been looking. She looked at everything now, reflexively, the way the last 10 days had restructured how she moved through space. She unlocked the door, went right, fast and quiet on the carpet, the opposite direction from where the men were moving. Behind her she heard a sound, not footsteps, but something heavier, a door, and then a voice that she placed after 2 steps as Gavin Rourke's, low and pressurized and very controlled, saying something she couldn't make out. She found the panel door, pressed at the correct point on the wood grain, the latch released the way she'd tested it. Twice, the second time she'd discovered the mechanism. And the door swung inward into darkness and the smell of cleaning products and old dust. She went in, pulled it shut behind her, and put her back against the wall in the dark, and did the one thing her body wanted to do, which was breathe, and did it as quietly as the tight thing in her chest would allow. The staircase was narrow and unlit and descended at a steep angle. She went down it by feel, one hand on the wall, taking each step with her weight on the outside edge where stairs were less likely to creak. 12 steps to a landing, turn, 8 more steps. A door at the bottom, unlocked. She came out into the kitchen. The kitchen was lit, low, the under-cabinet lights left on overnight, and empty. Outside the windows, the grounds were dark, and from somewhere, distant, she heard something that might have been a shout and might have been anything. She was standing in the kitchen of a house she couldn't leave with men she didn't know upstairs, and Gavin Rourke's voice somewhere in the structure above her, and for 30 seconds she let herself think about what she actually had available to her. The kitchen had knives. She picked one up, a paring knife, small enough to hold close, and then set it back down and picked up a heavier one, a chef's knife, and then set that down too, because carrying a knife into a situation she didn't fully understand was more likely to get her killed than not, if the first person she met with it was on the right side. She didn't know which side anything was on. She didn't know what was happening. She needed Lucien. That thought arrived with a clarity that she would have argued against forcefully 12 days ago, and couldn't argue against now, because what she needed was someone who understood the architecture of what was happening in this house tonight. And like it or not, that was him. She went to the door that connected the kitchen to the main corridor and opened it a crack. The main corridor was dark, in a way it shouldn't have been. The motion-sensing lights that came on when anyone walked the ground floor were off, which meant either the power to them had been cut or someone had disabled them, neither of which was incidental. At the far end of the corridor, near the entrance hall, there was light, a flashlight beam, moving, and then she heard gunfire. Not a single shot. A sequence of them, suppressed, the flat fut-fut sound she'd heard once in a movie and understood was real now in the way that things you've only encountered as abstraction become real when your body responds to them before your brain catches up. 2 shots. A pause. One more. Her hand on the door had gone rigid. From somewhere above her, from the second floor, she heard Lucien's voice. Not words, the walls ate the words, but the register of it, the tone, which was not frightened. It was furious in the cold, flat way she'd come to recognize as his particular frequency of danger. She made a decision. She went into the corridor. She kept to the wall, moving toward the staircase at the front of the house, the main one. The flashlight beam had stopped moving. There were voices now, at least 3 of them, in the entrance hall. And then footsteps on the stairs above her and a figure coming down fast, one hand on the rail, a gun in the other hand. She pressed herself into the shadow of the corridor wall. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and turned and the thin, ambient light from the entrance hall caught his face for a moment. It was Lucien. He had a gun, and there was something dark on his left forearm that might have been a sleeve or might not have been, and his expression was entirely concentrated in the way of someone operating on a frequency where nothing existed except the immediate problem. He looked at the corridor. He looked at her. For 1 second, he was completely still. "How did you get down here?" he said. "Staff staircase." She stepped out from the wall. The panel door on the second-floor corridor. Something moved through his expression, fast, almost invisible, that she classified afterward as surprise and filed next to everything else she'd collected about what surprised him. "Come," he said. He moved down the corridor and she followed him, which would have seemed insane to the version of her that had existed 2 weeks ago and made complete operational sense to the version of her that existed now. He took her to a room off the back of the corridor. A study, bookshelves, a heavy desk, and closed the door behind them. There was no lock on this one. He pushed the desk, one-handed, the gun still in his right hand, until it was against the door. She noted the dark on his left forearm was definitely not sleeve. "You're bleeding," she said. "Crease. It's not deep. You need to—" In a moment. He moved to the window, covered by heavy drapes, and pulled one edge aside with 2 fingers and looked out. "3 men on the grounds that I can confirm are not mine, probably more. The east and south gates are compromised." He let the drape fall. "There are 2 of my people still functioning upstairs, Dario on the west end and Petra." He paused. "Everyone else on the ground floor is—" He didn't finish. She understood what he didn't finish. "How many came in?" she said. "At minimum 6, could be 10. He turned from the window. His face in the room's darkness was all planes and shadow. This was coordinated. The surveillance loop, the gate, the timing. This was planned over days. Weeks, maybe. "Gavin," she said. He looked at her. "I heard his voice, she said. "On the second floor, when I was in the corridor." The room went very quiet. Lucien held completely still for a moment in the way of someone who has just heard something that confirms a calculation they'd hoped was wrong. Then he moved to the desk, around it rather than through it, and opened the top right drawer and took out a second weapon and held it for a moment. "Has Gavin ever seen you handle yourself?" he said. "This morning in the garden, last week in the sitting room. Does he know you're not afraid of him? I think that's why we're here." He looked at the second gun. Then he held it out to her. She looked at it. "I've never fired a weapon." "I know." "Then why?" "Because holding it is different from using it, and right now different is what we have." He kept it extended. "You take it, you hold it. If something comes through that door that isn't me, you point it and you make a decision. That's all." She took it. It was heavier than she'd expected, which she'd known intellectually and apparently not emotionally. Her hand adjusted its grip twice before settling into something that felt less wrong than the alternatives. "All right," she said. He was already moving back toward the draped window. He pulled the edge aside again, and this time she could hear what he'd been listening for. Outside, something was happening. Not gunfire now, but voices. The sound of organization, of people moving with purpose in the dark. "They're tightening the perimeter," he said, "which means they haven't found what they came for." "What did they come for?" He let the drape fall, turned, looked at her. "Me." She absorbed that. "And if they find you, that depends on whether Gavin wants a conversation or a conclusion." "What's the difference?" "The difference is whether I'm still breathing by morning." He said it without drama, which was the only way it could be said and still be useful information. From somewhere above them, a sound, quick, percussive, something falling, then silence. Then one of the suppressed shots again, close enough that she felt it in her back teeth. Lucien was already moving to the door, pulling the desk aside with the controlled urgency of someone who doesn't rush, but understands that not rushing is itself a calculated decision. He opened the door 2 inches and looked into the corridor. "Stay close," he said. "If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, you run. If we get separated—" He paused. "Don't get separated." "Comforting?" she said. "I'm not trying to comfort you." "I know. That's the part that's actually comforting." He looked at her for half a second. Then he moved into the corridor and she went with him. What happened in the next 7 minutes was not cinematic, in the way she would have expected from everything she'd seen and read and consumed in a life that had not prepared her for this. It was not coherent. It was a series of compressed, intensely physical moments interrupted by stillness and then compressed again. Lucien moved through his own house in the dark with a specific knowledge of it that she didn't have and couldn't replicate, and she followed close enough to reach out and touch the back of his jacket. He stopped twice in the corridor, once to listen, once to pull her sideways into a doorframe, when a figure appeared at the end of the hall and resolved into one of his own people, a woman she'd seen at the property, Petra, with blood on her neck and a gun in both hands and an expression of total operational focus. The three of them in the dark corridor. Lucien and Petra exchanged looks that were entire conversations. "Dario," he said. "West stairs. He's holding." "How many confirmed hostile?" 7. 2 are down. She glanced at Evelyn. "She shouldn't be here." "She is here," Lucien said. "Where is Gavin?" Petra's expression changed in a way that told Evelyn the answer before the answer came. "East corridor. He has 2 men. He's—" She stopped, started again. "He's not trying to reach the exits." "No," Lucien said. "He's trying to reach you." "Yes." The silence between them held everything that was obvious and hadn't been said, and Evelyn understood, not from what they said, but from the specific way they didn't say it, that Gavin was not with the men who'd come in from outside. He was separately positioned, which meant 2 separate movements happening simultaneously, which meant this was not a coup in the simple sense, but something layered, something in which Gavin's role was different from the exterior assault team's role. Which meant, "He's trying to get to you before they do," she said. Both of them looked at her. "He's not working with them," she said. "Or not entirely. They came in to take the house. He's trying to reach you first, to either warn you or—" She thought about the morning in the sitting room, the quality of his attention, the calculation under the courtesy. "Or to position himself as the one who delivers you." Lucien looked at her for a moment with that particular expression, the one she'd seen the first night in the diner when she'd said something he didn't expect to hear from her. "There's a third option," Petra said. "He wants to get to him first so there's no witness to what comes next." Nobody argued with that. Lucien turned. "Get her to the lower level," he said to Petra. "The room off the wine storage, the one with the secondary lock. Keep her there." "I'm not going to a room to wait," Evelyn said. "Evelyn, I can move quietly and I know the layout of the ground floor and I don't panic." She said it calmly, the way she said most things, which she'd found was either her best quality or her most infuriating one, depending on the audience. "You're 3 people against at minimum 5, and you need someone watching your back who isn't telegraphing every move from 20 feet away." "I'm not going to a room." Lucien looked at her with an expression that was not irritation and not admiration, and was something more complicated than either. "You don't know how to use that," he said, meaning the weapon in her hand. "I know how to throw it," she said. "I have good aim." Petra made a sound in the dark that might have been a laugh that had been disciplined back down before it fully formed. Lucien exhaled. "You stay behind us. You do exactly what I say exactly when I say it. Not after consideration. Not after you've made your own assessment. When." "Agreed. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, and we deal with that then." She met his eyes. "Are we going?" They went. The next 4 minutes she would never be able to fully reconstruct in chronological order. Memory under adrenaline doesn't record linearly. It records in images, in physical sensations, in sounds. She remembered the particular texture of the wall under her left hand as they moved through the back corridor. She remembered Lucien stopping so suddenly she walked into his back, and the controlled way he steadied her with one hand without turning around. She remembered the sound of a door being forced somewhere above them, the splintering of wood, and then running feet. She remembered Petra moving ahead of them into the entrance hall, and the sequence of events that followed happening too fast to fully separate. 2 figures coming down the main staircase, the exchange of suppressed shots, Petra going to one knee, one of the figures falling, the other retreating back up the stairs. She remembered Lucien's hand on her arm pulling her left when her instinct said, "Go right," and that being correct. And she remembered the moment they came around the corner into the east corridor and found Gavin Rourke. He was standing 15 feet away with 2 men behind him and a gun pointed, not at Lucien, but at a space between them. the deliberately ambiguous positioning of someone who hadn't fully committed to a specific outcome yet. The corridor was narrow, the three of them on one end, Gavin and his men on the other. The distance between them was not small enough for physical alternatives and not large enough for comfortable options. "Lucien," Gavin said, his voice was entirely even. "I'm going to need you to put that down." "No," Lucien said. "The men who came in tonight are Aldrin's people. You know what Aldrin wants." He paused. "I can negotiate your way out of this, but not if you're holding that. You let them in, Lucien said. It wasn't a question. Gavin looked at him, held the look for a moment. "I let them in to get to you, so I could get to you first." A pause. "So I could offer you a way out that isn't a box." "That's what you're calling it." "That's what it is." "What does Aldrin want?" "He wants the West Side territory and the port contracts. He wants them signed over. He wants you out of the business, alive." Another pause. "That last part is negotiable on his end, but I've been trying to keep it off the table." "For 11 years, Lucien said. "For 11 years, Gavin agreed. "And now," Gavin's eyes moved, just fractionally, a minimal shift, to Evelyn. "Now the math has changed." He looked back at Lucien. "She's the math. You started making decisions differently. I've been watching it. Everyone's been watching it." His voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed a speech and is now delivering it but finding that it sounds different out loud than it did in preparation. "You trusted someone outside the organization with operational information. You let her sit in on... You changed. In 2 weeks you changed in ways I haven't seen in 11 years, and that kind of change in this business means liability." He stopped, steadied something. "I've spent 11 years keeping this organization alive. I'm not going to let it come apart because you found someone who looks at you like you're worth..." "Gavin!" Lucien's voice cut across his. Flat. Final. Gavin stopped. "Put the gun down," Lucien said. "I can't do that." "Then we have a different problem than the one you came here to solve." The corridor held all three conversations simultaneously. The spoken one, the one happening in the space between the words, and the one happening in the body language of the two men behind Gavin who were reading their employer's uncertainty and adjusting their own positioning in response to it. Evelyn watched all three conversations and thought about Darren's, about the table with the business guests, about the argument she'd inadvertently diffused by saying the obvious thing that no one else would say. She thought about the fact that Gavin was still talking, which meant he was still deciding, which meant the decision wasn't made. She stepped forward. Lucien said her name. She kept moving. She walked to the midpoint of the corridor, between Lucien behind her and Gavin in front of her, and stopped. She was equidistant. She had the unfired weapon in her right hand, held at her side, which made it simultaneously present and non-threatening, and she understood from the way Gavin's eyes tracked it that he'd registered all of that. "You said the math changed," she said to him, "because of me." "That's right. You're wrong." She kept her voice level. The way she kept it level when Gerald came in complaining about napkin costs, and she needed him to hear her and not just react to her. "He didn't change because of me. He changed because of Darren's. I just made the Darren's thing visible faster than it would have become visible otherwise. The problem you're trying to solve isn't me. It's the fact that the organization had a 3-year infection in it, and the diagnostic tool he'd been using, fear, loyalty through fear, wasn't finding it." Gavin looked at her. "I'm a waitress," she said. "I am not a strategic liability. I am not a power player. I do not have influence in this world, and I have never wanted any." She felt the weight of the gun in her right hand and made a decision and set it carefully on the floor and stood back up. "I have no stake in your organization and nothing to gain from Lucien's downfall or his continuity. The only thing I told him was what I actually saw. If that's a liability, then your problem isn't with me. It's with the fact that honesty itself has become dangerous to you." The corridor was very quiet. One of Gavin's men had lowered his weapon slightly without appearing to decide to do so, which was the body doing what the mind hadn't gotten to yet. Gavin looked at the gun on the floor, looked at Evelyn, looked at Lucien, who had not moved, who was watching all of this with an expression she couldn't read from behind and could only imagine. "You're either the most useful person in this building," Gavin said slowly, or the most dangerous. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening behind his eyes, the working of something that had been set in motion and was now reaching its conclusion, and she could not tell from the outside which conclusion it was reaching. Then one of the men behind him, the one on the left, the one who'd lowered his weapon, said something in a low voice that she didn't catch. Gavin turned to look at him, and in the half-second that Gavin's attention moved, Lucienne moved. She didn't see all of it. What she saw was Lucien closing the distance in a way that someone who wasn't what he was couldn't have covered that quickly, and Gavin turning back too late, and the weapon leaving Gavin's hand with a controlled efficiency that spoke of exactly the kind of muscle memory you get from doing something many times. And then Gavin was against the wall with Lucien's forearm across his throat, and the gun in Lucien's hand, and the two men behind Gavin very carefully not making decisions. The corridor held. Lucien looked at Gavin, close, inches between them, and for a moment said nothing. "You let them into my house," he said. Gavin's voice came out compressed by the pressure on his throat. "I told you, I did it to get to you first." "3 of my people are dead," Lucien said. "On my property, in my house." His voice was almost conversational, which was the most frightening version of it. "Marcus, Reyes, Donnelly, you knew them." Gavin said nothing. "You knew them," Lucien said again. "I didn't know they'd—" He stopped. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "It always goes this far?" Lucien stepped back, gave him room, kept the weapon steady. "That's what you never understood. You plan for the first move and the second move, and you don't plan for what happens when real people start making decisions under pressure that you didn't account for." He looked at him for a moment with something that might have been grief if grief had been left in the cold long enough. "You've been with me 11 years. Gavin looked back at him. "11 years, Lucien said again. "And you looked at what I'd built and decided it was safer to sell it than to rebuild it." "I didn't want to sell anything." Gavin's voice had changed. The evenness had cracked, something underneath it showing. "I wanted to keep it alive. You've been—" He stopped, started again. "You started making decisions with your heart instead of your head. In 11 years, I have never seen you do that. And then she walked in, and 2 weeks later, you're—" He looked at Evelyn, and the look was not hatred exactly, but something adjacent to it that had the same temperature. "You're restructuring how you make decisions based on what a woman who tears up cash in a diner thinks of you. That's not business. That's something else. And something else gets people killed." The last word landed in the corridor and stayed there. Evelyn stood very still, because the thing about it, the thing she would not let herself examine fully until much later, was that he wasn't entirely wrong. She had changed something. She could see it, had seen it in the last days, in the way Lucien spoke to his people, and the way he'd handled the Darren situation, and the way he'd come to find her in the garden rather than waiting for the structured dinner. Something had shifted. She hadn't wanted it to shift and hadn't tried to shift it, and the shifting had happened anyway, the way water finds the path you didn't know you'd left open. She had done this. Not the men outside, and not the surveillance loop, and not Gavin's calculation about Aldrin's territory. She had changed something in the center of the equation that was this house and this organization, and the man who stood in this corridor with his forearm lowered and his gun steady, and the consequences of that change were 3 people dead on the grounds, and a man who'd been loyal for 11 years with his back against a wall. She picked up the weapon from the floor where she'd set it. She didn't know how to use it, and had said so, and still picked it up, because the alternative, standing here with empty hands, while the decision about what happened next was made entirely without her, was not a thing she could do. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was steady. She made it be. Lucien didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on Gavin. "The men outside," he said to Gavin. "Aldrin's people, you can call them off." Gavin looked at him. "And then what?" "And then we figure out what Aldrin actually wants and whether there's a version of this where fewer people end up in boxes." "You're negotiating." "I'm surviving," Lucien said. "I've been surviving since I was 19 years old, and every single time it's looked exactly like this. Someone thinks they found the angle that ends me, and instead I find the conversation they didn't know they were in." He paused. "Call them off, Gavin." A long moment. The corridor breathed. Gavin reached into his jacket, slowly, with the controlled carefulness of someone very aware of the gun pointed at him, and took out a phone. He made the call. It lasted 30 seconds, 2 sentences. The sound from outside, the movement, the organized presence of it, did not immediately stop, but it changed. The pressure of it, the directionality, shifted. When Gavin ended the call, he looked at Lucian with an expression that had gone through several things and arrived somewhere exhausted. "What happens to me?" he said. Lucian looked at him for a moment. "Right now, you're going to help us get the people outside off this property cleanly. After that," he paused. "After that, we're going to have the longest conversation of your life." Gavin nodded. Once. The movement of someone who has just accepted the architecture of a situation they can't change. And Evelyn stood in the corridor between them, the gun in her hand, the weight of what she'd set in motion sitting somewhere in the center of her chest alongside the image of a man she'd never wanted to trust, telling a man he'd known for 11 years that something had changed, and the understanding that the thing that had changed was her, whether she'd intended it or not, and that there was no version of the next hour in which she could pretend otherwise. She had walked into this house as a prisoner. She had walked into this corridor on her own, and in the morning, when the last of Aldrin's men had been removed from the property, and Gavin sat across the table from Lucian with the long, exhausted look of someone who had tried to burn a house down and was now being asked to help repair it. In that morning, Lucian would look at Evelyn across the same table with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and say 4 words that would make every wall she'd built between understanding him and trusting him collapse at once, and she would not be ready for it, and it would not matter that she wasn't ready, because the moment was already there. The morning came gray and exhausted, the way mornings do after nights that have taken too much from too many people. Evelyn sat at the long table in the dining room that was too large for 2 people and was now full of them. Lucienne at the head, Gavin to his left, Petra with her neck wound dressed, and her expression unreddened, 2 other men she knew by face and not by name positioned near the doors, and herself at the corner, which was neither the foot of the table nor the middle, and felt like what it was, a position that hadn't existed in this room before her and hadn't been formally assigned and was there because she was there and no one had found a reason sufficient to remove her. There was coffee. She drank it. The window showed the grounds in the early gray light, the mess of the night, the marks on the lawn where vehicles had come and gone, a section of fence near the east gate that had been damaged and was now being looked at by 2 men who had the body language of people assessing something they were going to have to explain to someone they didn't want to explain it to. 3 people dead. She kept coming back to that number, not as abstraction, as weight. Lucian was talking. He'd been talking for 20 minutes in the quiet, flat voice he used when he was operating on pure function, when whatever feeling was underneath had been set aside for the duration of the necessity. He was talking about Aldrin, about the port contracts, about the specific financial architecture of the arrangement Gavin had been negotiating on Aldrin's behalf for, and this was the part that had landed hardest in the corridor and continued to land in the morning. 14 months. Not weeks. 14 months. Gavin sat across the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on Lucian, and the expression of someone who has stopped defending a position and is now simply enduring the accounting of it. 14 months, Lucian said. He said it for the 3rd time, not for emphasis. More like he was still in the process of fitting it into the space his understanding of the previous 14 months had occupied. The Aldrin conversation started 14 months ago. It started as a contingency, Gavin said. That's all it was at the start. And then it became something else. And then it became something else, Gavin agreed. He said it without flinching, which was either courage or exhaustion or some combination that had become indistinguishable from each other over the course of a very long night. When? Lucian said. Gavin looked at the table. Around month 4. What happened at month 4? A pause. Reyes started talking about leaving. He didn't leave, but he talked about it. And you know Reyes. When Reyes starts talking about something, it means 6 other people are thinking it and not saying it. I started looking at the numbers differently, thinking about whether the structure was sustainable without the port contracts, whether Aldrin was going to be an inevitability or a choice. He looked up. I decided I'd rather make it a choice. And you decided that alone. Yes, without telling me. You would have said no. I would have said no, Lucian confirmed. The flatness of his voice, was the most damning thing in the room. It contained no surprise. Because it was wrong. Gavin's jaw tightened. It was practical. It was a decision to sell pieces of something that wasn't only yours to sell. Lucian looked at him for a moment. And it cost 3 people their lives. The room held that. Evelyn watched Gavin absorb it. She watched him want to argue and not argue, watched him find the place where the argument stopped, because the wall it ran into was the fact of Marcus and Reyes and Donnelly. And a wall made of that specific material doesn't move, regardless of how legitimate the architecture on the other side of it might be. What do you want from me? Gavin said. Right now I want every piece of the Aldrin arrangement, every communication, every financial instrument, every promise made, every timeline discussed. Lucien picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. After that, I want a full accounting of every decision you made independently in the last 14 months that intersected with Aldrin's interests. Gavin looked at him. That's going to take time. We have time, he paused. For the moment landed with a weight that everyone in the room registered without commenting on. Lucien looked at Evelyn then, directly, the first time he'd looked at her directly since the corridor. And she saw in his face what 14 months of operational betrayal from the person closest to him looked like when someone had been awake all night and was being honest with themselves about it. It looked like what it was. It looked tired, and it looked like something that had been load-bearing for a very long time, had been quietly removed, and the structure above it was currently deciding what to do about gravity. He said the 4 words then, I need your help. Not performed, not calculated, not the version of asking for something that comes with leverage and strings and a clear accounting of what's expected in return. Just the 4 words directed at her from a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing a reality in which those 4 words were a vulnerability he would not expose. She looked at him. She thought about the night he'd taken her from the diner, and the morning she'd torn up his money, and the evening in the garden when she'd understood she was already too far into understanding him for her own comfort. She thought about the gun on the floor in the corridor and the fact that she'd picked it back up, and what picking it back up had meant, and whether she'd known what it meant when she did it. All right, she said. And the thing that happened in that room in that moment was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was simply a shift. The way the first light of morning shifts the quality of darkness, not by defeating it, but by changing what can be seen within it. That was at 7:43 in the morning. By noon, everything had changed again. The call came through on a line Lucien kept separate from the primary organization communications, a number so restricted that when it rang, the 2 men near the doors came immediately upright without being told. Lucien looked at the phone when it was brought to him, looked at the number on the screen, and set his coffee down with a controlled care that told Evelyn more than any expression. He took the call in the corridor. Evelyn didn't follow him. She sat at the table and watched Gavin watch the door and thought about the fact that Gavin's decision to call off Aldrin's men the night before had been a choice that could be unmade, and that Aldrin himself had not been present for any of the night's events, and that a man like Aldrin, the name had come up enough times now that she'd built a shape around it, a specific gravity, would not accept the return of his people empty-handed without a response. Lucien came back into the dining room after 4 minutes. He stood at the head of the table and looked at all of them and said, Aldrin wants a meeting. Silence. When? Petra said. Tonight. That's not enough time to... I know. The perimeter isn't secured. We have 3 vacancies in the security rotation, and Gavin's position is... She stopped, looked at Gavin, looked back at Lucien. Complicated. I know all of that. Then you know we can't do tonight. We don't have a choice about tonight. He looked at Gavin. Aldrin specified terms. He wants representation for my organization that includes you. Gavin looked at him. He wants to know I'm still functional. He wants to know whether what happened last night was a failed coup or a deliberate repositioning. If it was a repositioning, he wants to know where you stand. If it was a failure, he didn't finish. If it was a failure, I'm a liability to him, Gavin said, and he'll want that dealt with. Yes. The words sat there like a stone. Gavin looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Lucy. N. You could tell him it was a repositioning. I could. It would give you cover. You'd come to the meeting with your lieutenant and present a unified front. Aldrin would read that as strength. He might negotiate rather than press. And you, Gavin met his eyes. I'd owe you something I'd spend the rest of my working life paying back. Lucian looked at him for a long moment, with that expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was doing the actual moral calculation beneath the strategic one, when he was deciding not just what would work, but what he could live with. We'll discuss what you owe later, he said. Right now we're going to Aldrin's meeting and we're going to do it on my terms, not his. He looked at Evelyn. You're not coming, he said. I know, she said. She'd already known. The knowing had a particular texture to it that she examined briefly and put away. What do you need from me before you go? He sat down. And for the next 3 hours, in the too large dining room with the gray morning light shifting through the windows, Evelyn Cross, waitress, former overnight shift, Danny's sister, the woman who had knocked a crime lord unconscious and torn up $4,000 and picked up a gun she didn't know how to use, helped Lucien Moreau build the architecture of a negotiation that was going to determine whether the next 24 hours ended in one kind of outcome or another. She was not naive about what she was doing. She didn't let herself be. The clarity she'd always carried, the same clarity that had made her useful in the diner, that had gotten her through 6 years of putting other people's needs ahead of her own without losing track of herself entirely. That clarity worked in all directions, including uncomfortable ones. She was helping a criminal prepare to negotiate with another criminal, and the fact that she'd arrived here by force rather than choice did not alter the material reality of what her assistance was enabling. She held that knowledge. She didn't set it down. And she helped anyway because the alternative was 3 more dead people, and she'd already absorbed as much of that weight as she could carry. By 3 in the afternoon, she'd eaten something and hadn't slept, and could feel the specific exhaustion that comes from operating on adrenaline reserves that have been fully spent. Her hands were steady. Her thinking was clear. The rest of her was somewhere behind the clarity, queued up for when there was time. Lucian left at 4:15. Gavin went with him. Petra stayed. Evelyn sat in the garden in the cold afternoon air and thought about Danny and whether the next message from her phone was going to have to say something more elaborate than family situation out of state, and how long a lie like that could hold before it started to leak at the edges. She was still sitting there when the second phone call came. Not for Lucien. He was gone. For her. Petra appeared at this garden door with a look on her face that Evelyn had not seen on Petra's face before. And Petra was not a person whose face generally offered previews. You need to come inside, she said. Evelyn came inside. The phone was in the study. Landline, old, the kind that had a cord. Petra handed her the receiver with the particular carefulness of someone handling something they don't want to be responsible for. Hello, Evelyn said. The voice on the other end was not a voice she knew. Male. Unhurried. The specific unhurry of someone who has decided that urgency is a form of weakness and has trained the urgency out of his voice so completely that its absence had become its own form of pressure. Miss Cross, the voice said, my name is Aldrin. The air in the study changed. I think, he continued, that you and I should have a private conversation before this evening's meeting takes place. She looked at Petra. Petra's expression confirmed what she'd already understood. This call had not been anticipated. This number was not supposed to be reachable by anyone not inside the organization. The fact that Aldrin had it meant something that was going to require unpacking later, if there was a later in which unpacking was available. How did you get this number? She said. I have extensive resources, Aldrin said. Miss Cross, I've been watching the situation in that house with considerable interest for the past 2 weeks. I know who you are. I know how you arrived there. I know what role you've been playing. A pause. Small, deliberate. I know about your brother. The thing that went through her then was not cold fear, but hot, immediate, animal. She made herself stand still inside it. Danny has nothing to do with any of this, she said. Of course not. He's a junior at Caldwell studying civil engineering. He's completely uninvolved. Another pause. I'd like to keep it that way. Say what you're saying, she said. Her voice was entirely level. She made it be, the same way she'd made it be across the diner counter and in the corridor last night, because the only tool she had that she was certain of was the ability to not let what was happening inside her become visible unless she decided it should be. I'm saying that the meeting tonight creates a specific outcome regardless of how well Lucien prepares for it. The outcome is that he leaves with a reduced organization, reduced territory, and a very clear understanding of what happens if he resists that reduction. The voice remained unhurried throughout, conversational, the tone of someone explaining a weather pattern. What you can do, specifically you, Ms. Cross, is ease that process considerably. All I need is an honest assessment from someone who has spent the last 2 weeks inside that organization with no stake in its continuation. You want me to tell you where he's weak. I want you to tell me where the structure is unsound. There's a difference. There isn't. A slight pause, the first one that felt unplanned. You're more direct than I was told. I've been told that before. Ms. Cross. The voice shifted, fractionally, almost nothing, but she caught it. The way you catch the moment a friendly tide shifts and becomes something else. I'm going to be very direct with you in return. What I'm offering you is simple. Your brother completes his degree without financial disruption. You return to your life without any of this following you. And the man who took you out of a diner at midnight faces a consequence that is proportionate. All of that in exchange for 30 minutes of honest conversation before 6 o'clock tonight. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was considering it, because she was thinking about exactly what she was going to say and needed to choose it correctly. You're offering me a deal, she said. Yes. Based on the assumption that I have no loyalty to Lucien Moreau. Based on the fact that he kidnapped you, Aldrin said. Loyalty would be irrational. I've been told a lot of things are irrational, she said. Most of them by people who wanted me to do something that served them and thought calling it rational would be persuasive. She felt the weight of the receiver in her hand, the cord, the particular solidity of it. I'm not going to help you. Not because I've decided Lucien deserves my loyalty, but because I've decided you don't deserve the information. There's a difference. Silence on the line. That's unfortunate, Aldrin said. The unhurried quality of his voice had returned, but it sat differently now. The way a temperature change in a room sits differently than the room's original temperature, even when you can't point to a specific degree. I hope the meeting tonight goes the way he's planning. So do I, she said. She hung up. She stood with her hand on the receiver for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Petra. Get Lucien on the phone, she said. Right now. Petra was already reaching for her phone. He won't pick up during the drive, then we wait until he does, and tell him the moment he does. She moved to the window. The grounds were still and cold, and the damaged fence near the east gate was still being worked on. Aldrin called this number, which means someone inside gave it to him. In the last... She checked the time. 19 hours since last night. Petra looked up from her phone. Someone in this house, Evelyn said, is still talking to Aldrin. The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes when a room full of people suddenly becomes uncertain about every other person in it. It lasted 4 seconds. Then Petra said, Gavin is with Lucien right now. And they looked at each other. And Evelyn felt the whole careful architecture of the morning's work. The conversation, the negotiation preparation, the fragile rebuilt structure of it, begin to tilt on its axis, because Gavin had made one call to pull Aldrin's men out, and Gavin was now in a car with Lucien, and Aldrin had a phone number he should not have had. And all of those facts were separate, and all of them were connected, and the connection between them was something she needed Lucien to understand before 6 o'clock, and it was now 4:37. Petra's call went to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. Try the driver, Evelyn said. I don't have the driver's... Then try Gavin. Petra looked at her. If Gavin is... I know. Try him anyway. If he picks up, we learn something. If he doesn't, we learn something different. Petra dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. On the 6th ring, Gavin picked up. His voice was wrong in the specific way of a voice that is performing normalcy while something else is happening around it. Petra. Gavin, we need to speak to Lucy. A pause. 1 second. 2. In the background of the call, Evelyn could hear road noise, an engine, and something else. Something she couldn't identify for a moment and then did identify. The way you recognize a sound that you've heard before in a context where it meant something. It was breathing. A second person's breathing, close to the phone, controlled. He's not available right now, Gavin said. Gavin, Petra's voice was very careful. Put him on. Another pause. We're almost at the location. We'll check in after. He ended the call. Petra lowered the phone. Evelyn said, "What was that sound?" "I don't—" In the background. The breathing. That wasn't road noise. She turned from the window. That was someone managing a physical situation, someone keeping their breathing controlled because they were working at something. Petra's face had gone to a place that wasn't fear and wasn't certainty, but was the worst combination of not being able to disprove either. "We have to get to them," Evelyn said. "The location is— Where is it?" "I don't know the specific address. Aldrin's people sent it to Lucian's secure phone an hour ago." "Can you find it?" "I can try to pull the last GPS ping from Lucian's phone if it's still transmitting." She was already moving, already on a different device, her fingers moving with the specific urgency of someone who is trained for exactly this kind of search and hates that the training is needed. Evelyn stood in the center of the study and ran the facts. Gavin had called off Aldrin's men at Lucian's instruction, but a call that could be made could also be unmade, or made conditional, or made with caveats that weren't conveyed to the people in the corridor. Gavin had spent 14 months building a relationship with Aldrin. 14 months was not a brief alliance. 14 months was something that had structural integrity of its own by this point, regardless of what had happened in the corridor last night. And Lucian had walked into a car with the man who'd been building it. "I've got a ping," Petra said. She turned the device so Evelyn could see the map on the screen. A point on the eastern edge of the city, an industrial area she didn't know but could see from the map context, was isolated. Warehouses, low foot traffic, the kind of geography that is chosen for specific reasons. "How far?" Evelyn said. 22 minutes. "Can we get there?" Petra looked at her. It was not a simple look. It contained the entire complexity of the situation, the depleted security rotation, the damaged perimeter, the uncertainty about who in the house was clean, compressed into a single exchange of eye contact. "There are 2 people I'm certain about," Petra said. "Myself and 1 other." 3 people, Evelyn said. Petra looked at her. 3 people, Evelyn said again. "Let's go." They moved fast. Through the kitchen, through the back corridor, to the garage where 3 vehicles were parked. Petra took the keys to the middle one, dark, mid-sized, the kind of car that said nothing about itself. And the third person, a man named Cord, who had been at the property since before Evelyn arrived, and had the specific watchfulness of someone who has never once in his professional life been surprised by something he should have anticipated, got in the back without being asked. They pulled out of the garage at 4:49, 22 minutes on a map that didn't account for the specific weight of what was in the car. 3 people going toward a situation they couldn't fully see, armed with information that might be enough and might not be. Moving through city traffic that didn't know or care what was happening inside the vehicle cutting through it. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat and watched the city move past and thought about the diner. About the particular way the fluorescent light above booth 4 had flickered every 40 seconds. About Danny's voice on the phone. The way he said her name when something was wrong. The upward inflection that was the same now as it had been when he was 9 years old and called her from a neighbor's house because he'd hurt his knee and didn't want to cry in front of strangers. She thought about what she'd said to Aldrin on the phone. About how she'd said it. About whether she'd made the right call and whether making the right call in a situation with no right calls was still meaningful. She thought about Lucian saying, "I need your help," with the specific exhaustion of someone who had finally found the edge of what they could carry alone. The warehouse district came into view at 5:11. Petra slowed. Cut the headlights a block before the turn, which Evelyn registered as a trained response and was grateful for. The GPS point was a building at the end of a short access road. Gray concrete, loading dock on the left side. 2 vehicles parked at angles outside that suggested they'd been stopped quickly rather than parked intentionally. Lights on inside, bleeding through the gaps in the roller doors. Cord had a gun out. Petra had hers. Evelyn had the weapon she'd picked up off the corridor floor the night before and had not fired and still carried because setting it down felt like the wrong kind of statement. "There are at least 4 people inside," Cord said, "based on the vehicles." "There are at least 4, Petra agreed. "Could be more." "Gavin brought 2 men with him," Evelyn said. "Lucian had his driver. That's 4 without counting whoever Aldrin had inside waiting." "Waiting," Petra repeated. The meeting was Aldrin's invitation. He had time to prepare the location. She looked at the building. He's been preparing this for longer than tonight. They sat in the car in the dark, a block from the building, and the weight of the moment had a specific texture. Not paralysis, but the compressed stillness that precedes action when the body is already committed and the mind is finishing the last of the calculation. "We can't go in the front," Petra said. "No. There's a personnel door on the east side, loading access." She looked at Cord. He nodded. "We go in low and fast and we assess before we act. No shooting unless—" "Unless," Cord said. "Unless." She looked at Evelyn. "You stay—" "Don't," Evelyn said. Petra looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Stay close and don't make decisions independently. If it goes sideways, your job is to get to Lucian and get him out. Not to engage, not to assess. Get to him and get him out. Can you do that?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "All right." They got out of the car. The access road was gravel, and she walked on the edges of it where the sound was less. The way she'd walked down the staff staircase the night before. Weight on the outside. Nothing wasted. The night air was cold and smelled of the river and old concrete, and she could see her breath in the thin light from a distant street lamp. The personnel door on the east side was unlocked. Not forced. Unlocked, which told her everything about whether this location had been prepared in advance, and she filed it and kept moving. Inside the building was large and partially empty. The specific emptiness of a warehouse that had been active and then wasn't. Machinery removed, shelving framework still bolted to the floor, the echo of footsteps in the height of the space above. Light came from the far end, portable work lights, the kind you position deliberately. And in the light she could see figures, and she could hear a voice she recognized. Aldrin's voice, still unhurried, still conversational, saying something she couldn't make out from this distance and this angle. And then a sound that stopped her mid-step. A single, sharp, physical sound. The specific sound of impact that has a human body on the receiving end of it. And after it, a silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell her the silence was chosen by someone who had the ability to choose it, and was choosing it because making a sound was not something they were going to do. Lucien. She knew it was him before she could have said why she knew it. The same way she'd known Danny's voice on the phone from the first half second, the way the body knows things it hasn't been told. Petra's hand found her arm in the dark and held it, not restraining, steadying, and when Evelyn looked at her, Petra shook her head once. Not yet. Wait. Evelyn looked at the figures at the far end of the building. She counted. She breathed. She held the gun in her hand with a grip that was steadier than it had any right to be. And then she saw Gavin. He was standing to the left of the lit area, separate from Aldrin's men, and his body language was not the body language of a man who was a prisoner or a man who was resisting what was happening. He was standing with the particular stillness of someone who is watching a thing unfold that they set in motion and are now seeing through to its conclusion. And Lucien was on his knees 12 feet in front of him. Evelyn felt something go very quiet inside her. Not fear, not fury. Something beneath both of them. Something older and simpler and more absolute. The thing that had made her pick up the weapon last night. That had made her walk into the corridor. That had made her sit down in the garden and say, "All right," when he said, "I need your help." She looked at Petra. Petra was looking at the same thing she was looking at, counting the same numbers, running the same calculation. 3 of them positioned, Petra said. Barely a sound. Gavin is the variable. Gavin is not going to help us, Evelyn said. No. So it's 3 against 3. With 1 untrained. Petra looked at her. You need to... I know what I need to do, Evelyn said. Aldrin's voice carried across the warehouse. Still unhurried, still that specific quality of a man who has arranged a room to his specifications and is comfortable in it, saying something that ended with Lucien's name in a way that was not a question. And Lucien, on his knees, with blood on his face that was visible even at this distance in this light, said something back. She couldn't hear what he said, but she heard the laugh it produced from the man standing in front of him. And she understood from the quality of that laugh that the conversation had reached a point where laughing was the next thing, which meant that what came after the laughing was going to be something she had very little time to interrupt. She looked at Cord. He looked at her. He looked at Petra. Petra looked at the 3 figures. looked at Gavin, looked at the distance between their current position and the lit area, ran whatever final calculation she was running. Then she said quietly to both of them, "On my count." And the warehouse held its breath. Petra said now, and the warehouse stopped being still. It happened in the compressed, non-linear way that violent things happen. Not a sequence, but a simultaneity. Everything occurring in the same 3 seconds, and the brain sorting it into order afterward because the brain needs order and the moment itself has none. Cord went left along the wall toward the nearest of Aldrin's positioned men. Petra went straight, low and fast, covering ground in the way of someone who had done this before and had stopped thinking about it as something that needed to be thought about. Evelyn went right, which put her on a diagonal toward the lit area, toward the figures, toward Lucien on his knees with blood on his face. The first shot was suppressed, and she felt it more than heard it. The displacement of air, the specific wrongness of something passing through space at that velocity in an enclosed area. She didn't know whose shot it was. She kept moving. The portable work lights threw harsh, flat illumination that created deep shadows at the edges, and she moved through those shadows the way she'd moved through the dark corridor 2 nights before, keeping to the geometry of the space, reading it as she moved through it. Shelving frameworks. A forklift. Inactive, off to the right. A stack of wooden pallets between her and the lit area that provided cover she used without breaking stride. She reached the pallets and stopped. From here she could see everything. Lucien was 7 feet away from her. On his knees, wrists bound behind him with zip ties, a cut above his left eye that had bled down the side of his face and dried there in a dark line. His suit jacket was gone. His shirt had been torn at the shoulder. He was upright, deliberately, visibly upright, the posture of someone who has decided that the last thing they control is whether they bow and has decided the answer is no. Aldrin stood in front of him. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, compact, 60s, with the particular grooming of a man who has been wealthy long enough that it has become invisible to him, something he maintains without noticing because anything else would feel wrong. He had a gun in his right hand that he was holding the way people hold things they haven't decided to use yet. Behind Aldrin, 2 of his men. One of them was looking in the direction of the sounds from the left side of the warehouse, Cord's direction, with an alertness that meant the situation out there had registered and was being assessed. Gavin stood to the left. He was watching Lucien with the expression of someone watching something they set in motion and are now finding costs more than the budgeted amount. Evelyn looked at Lucien. He had not looked at her. His eyes were on Aldrin, fixed there with the specific quality of attention that takes up all the available bandwidth so that nothing behind it leaks through. He was not looking for her. He did not know she was here. She looked at Gavin. Gavin was not looking at her either. She looked at Aldrin's gun, and she made the only decision available to her, which was to stop calculating and move. She came out from behind the pallets and she walked, not ran, walked, because running was panic, and panic was noise, and noise was the opposite of the thing she needed. Into the lit area with the weapon in her hand, and she stopped 4 feet from Aldrin and said, "Put it down." The warehouse went very strange. Aldrin turned to look at her with an expression that went through several things rapidly. Surprise, assessment, something that resolved into the specific quality of a man recalibrating without showing that he's recalibrating. His gun did not move. Lucien's eyes found her. She felt them land on her face, and she did not look at him because she could not afford to look at him right now, and she understood from the steadiness in her own chest that he knew that too. "Ms. Cross," Aldrin said, the unhurried voice still there, still practiced. "You're a long way from the house." "Put the gun down," she said again. "You won't shoot me," he said. "I haven't decided that yet. You told me on the phone that you'd never fired a weapon." "I told you I'd never fired one. I didn't say I wouldn't." She kept the gun level. Her arm was steady in a way that surprised her at some level below the level she was currently operating on. "The first one is supposed to be the hardest. I'm finding the decision part is harder than the physical part." From the left side of the warehouse, a sound. Something falling, something heavy, and then silence that lasted long enough to mean something had been resolved over there. Aldrin's second man had started to move toward it and stopped, caught between the 2 events, his positioning suddenly wrong for both. Aldrin looked at her with the expression of the recalibration moving forward. "What is it you think happens now?" he said. "You put the gun down," she said. And we have the conversation we should have had when you called me at the house, instead of the one you wanted to have. Which conversation is that? The one where you tell me what you actually want from Lucien's organization, and he tells you what he's willing to give, and someone who doesn't have a stake in the outcome tells you both when the other one is lying. She watched his face. Which is what you wanted when you called me. Before you decided intimidation was faster. Something moved in Aldrin's expression, very small. The adjustment of a man who had built his entire operational life on reading rooms accurately and had just been read in a room he'd arranged himself. You're negotiating, he said. Someone has to. He kidnapped you. Twice now, in different ways, she said. I'm still here. That should tell you something about how I weigh that. She did not lower the gun. What do you actually want? A pause. Long enough that the geometry of the room shifted slightly inside it. Gavin, she noticed from her peripheral vision, had moved half a step. Not toward anyone. Just adjusted his position, the movement of someone whose calculation was being revised by what they were watching. The port contracts, Aldrin said. And the West Side distribution. That's what you told Gavin 14 months ago. Aldrin looked at her. Gavin talked to you. Gavin talked to Lucien this morning. I was in the room. She held his gaze. The port contracts are negotiable. The West Side distribution is not, because it covers 3 legitimate businesses that Lucien has been in the process of converting for the past year, and handing those to you would destroy jobs that don't have anything to do with this conversation. She watched his face. You don't actually need the West Side distribution. You need the revenue stream it represents. There are other ways to get to the same number. The warehouse was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Even the building itself seemed to have settled into a listening posture. Aldrin looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Lucien. He looked back at her. You've been inside his organization for 2 weeks, he said. 12 days. And you know his financials. I know what people tell me when they think I'm just listening and not retaining. She kept her voice even. Put the gun down. Sit down. Let's have the actual conversation. Another pause. Then Aldrin lowered the gun. Not all the way, not a disarming, but lowered, pointed at the floor, the posture of someone who has not conceded but has agreed to a temporary suspension of the physical argument. Untie him, Evelyn said. Aldrin looked at her. If you want a conversation, she said, everyone sits at the same level. Aldrin made a small gesture to his remaining man near the lit area. The man produced a knife and cut the zip ties from Lucien's wrists. Lucien stood up slowly, not because he was weak, she could see that, but because he was choosing the pace of it, and straightened to his full height and said nothing. He looked at Evelyn for one moment, one full second of direct eye contact. She couldn't have said afterward what was in that look, and she didn't try. Then he looked at Aldrin. Sit, he said. They sat, all of them, on upturned crates and the forklift's side step and a piece of the shelving framework that had been pulled free and was horizontal. The improvised seating of a warehouse at night in a situation that had not been designed for conversation and was now being required to host one. Petra appeared from the left side of the building. She had a cut on her forearm and she was holding her weapon at her side, and she was alone, which told Evelyn what she needed to know about the resolution on the left side without asking. She positioned herself at the edge of the lit area and said nothing. Cord appeared behind her. Similar condition. Similar silence. Aldrin looked at the assembled room and appeared to make a further recalibration. 2 of his men were no longer functional. Gavin's position was ambiguous. The woman he'd called on the house phone 4 hours ago was standing in his warehouse with a gun she still hadn't lowered all the way, and had apparently just restructured his opening position using information she'd retained from conversations she wasn't party to. All right, he said. It was the same word Evelyn had used in the dining room that morning, and she noted that without letting it mean anything yet. Talk. What followed was not what it looked like from the outside, which was a negotiation. From the inside, it was something else. A truth-telling session that took on the quality of those sessions sometimes do when everyone in the room is too tired and has too much blood on them to sustain pretense. Lucien talked about the port contracts with the specific clarity of someone who has stopped protecting information because the cost of protecting it has exceeded the value of the protection. Aldrin talked about what he actually needed from the West Side arrangement, not the territory, she'd been right about that, but access to the logistics network that ran through it, which was a different and more solvable problem. Gavin said almost nothing for 40 minutes, and then said one thing very quietly that was so accurate about the structural redundancy in both organizations that everyone in the room looked at him, and he looked at the floor. Evelyn sat at the edge of the circle and spoke when something was wrong, and stayed quiet when it wasn't. She was aware of Lucien's awareness of her in the way you're aware of heat from a source you're not looking at directly. Peripheral, constant, something you'd feel the absence of. At 6:47, Aldrin put his gun fully away. At 7:15, they had the outline of something that was not a piece exactly, but was the architecture of one. A structure that would require more conversation and legal work and time before it became real, but that had the quality of something two people had actually built together rather than something one person had imposed on another. At 7:30, Aldrin stood up, looked at Evelyn, and said, "You should have taken my deal." "Your deal required me to betray someone," she said. "That was never on the table." He looked at her for a moment. "You have loyalty to a man who kidnapped you." "I have loyalty to the version of him I've seen for 12 days, she said. "That's a different thing, and it's mine to decide what I do with it." Aldrin nodded once. Then he looked at Lucien. "Your organization is going to look very different in a year." "Yes," Lucien said. "That's not a complaint." He picked up his jacket from where it had been draped over a crate. "It might even survive it." He looked around the warehouse, at the non-functional state of two of his people, at the damage to the general situation, at the distance between what he'd planned when he arranged this location and what had actually occurred here. "This is not how I expected tonight to go." "No," Lucien said. Aldrin left. His remaining man helped the two incapacitated ones. Neither dead, Evelyn had established that early, a fact she held onto with both hands because the alternative was something she couldn't process tonight. They went out through the loading dock, the sound of vehicles starting, then gone. The warehouse held 5 people in the sudden quiet. Evelyn lowered the gun for the first time. Her arm, which had been steady throughout, announced its objection to the duration of that steadiness with a tremor that moved from her shoulder to her wrist and disappeared. She noted it. Let it go. Lucien was looking at Gavin. Gavin was looking at the floor. The silence between them had the specific weight of 11 years in it. All of it. The whole accumulated mass of it. The good and the operational. And the 14 months of quiet, separate navigation. And the night in the corridor and the zip ties and the blood drying on Lucien's face. All of it in the room, taking up space. "I didn't tell them to touch you," Gavin said, still looking at the floor. "I know," Lucien said. "I told Aldrin the meeting needed to be clean. He agreed. He didn't—" He stopped. "He did it before I could stop it. And then you stood there." A pause. "Yes." "While he did it." Another pause. Longer. "Yes." Lucien looked at him for a long moment. She watched his face, and what she saw there was not rage. Rage would have been simpler and in some ways easier, but something more complicated. The specific grief of someone confronting the full cost of a trust that had been structural, load-bearing, and wrong. "You need to go," Lucien said. Gavin looked up. "Lucien, not from the city, not forever. But tonight you need to go somewhere that isn't a conversation we're both in, because right now I don't have—" He stopped. Started again. The pauses were not weakness. They were the careful placement of someone choosing accuracy over fluency. "I don't have the distance yet to say what needs to be said to you without it being wrong. And I'd rather say the right thing late than the wrong thing now." Gavin looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained the entirety of 11 years and their current condition and what the distance between those two things had cost. "All right," he said. He left. Petra and Cord exchanged a look and then, with the professional tact of people who understood when a room needed fewer people in it, moved toward the loading dock. The warehouse had 2 people in it. Evelyn sat on the upturned crate and looked at the floor of the warehouse and allowed, for the first time since she'd come out from behind the pallets, the full weight of what the last 2 hours had been to settle onto her. It arrived in stages, the shaking in her arms spreading to both hands, a quality of cold that had nothing to do with the building's temperature, a tightness in her throat that she identified and managed and let go. She heard Lucien sit down, close, the crate beside hers. She didn't look at him immediately. He didn't speak immediately. They sat in the aftermath of the warehouse in the dying light of the portable work lights and breathed. "You found the GPS ping," he said. "Petra did." "How did you know something was wrong?" "Aldrin called the house. A number he shouldn't have had." She looked at her hands. The gun was still in her right hand, and she set it carefully on the floor beside the crate. "He wanted information about you. I told him no. Then I heard Gavin's voice on the phone with Petra and the breathing in the background." She paused. "The breathing was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have stayed at the house." "Yes." Petra got here because I pushed her to. She wasn't going to act without more certainty than we had, and we didn't have time for more certainty." She looked up then, finally, and looked at him. The cut above his eye had stopped bleeding, but the dried blood was still there, dark against his skin, and there were marks on his wrists from the zip ties, and he was sitting with the posture of someone carrying physical damage that he was not going to mention. "Let me look at that," she said. "It's fine." "You said that last night about the arm. Let me look." He didn't argue. He turned slightly toward her, and she leaned in and looked at the cut. Not deep, didn't need stitches, but ugly, the kind of thing that would make itself known for a week. She looked at his wrists. The zip ties had been tight enough to leave marks that would bruise. She sat back. "You need to clean that," she said. "When we get back." "When we get back," she agreed. They sat again. Outside, distantly, the city made its sounds. Traffic, a siren somewhere north. The ambient frequencies of a place that didn't know or care what had happened in a warehouse at its edge tonight. She found that comforting in a specific way. The city continuing to be itself. It was steady in the way that indifferent things are sometimes steady. "I'm going to ask you something," Lucien said, "and I want you to answer it the way you answer everything, without calculation." She looked at him. "Did you come here tonight because it was strategically correct?" he said, "or because you couldn't not come?" The question sat there. She let it sit. She didn't rush toward an answer because he'd asked her not to calculate, and a rushed answer was its own kind of calculation. "The second one," she said. He absorbed that, looked at the floor, looked at his hands, at the marks on his wrists. "I need to tell you something." "All right." "Your brother's tuition, the amount he owed, the financial aid situation." He paused. "I had it resolved 3 days after you arrived at the house, without telling you." She looked at him. "Not as leverage," he said. I want to be clear about that, not to create obligation or to—" He stopped. "I did it because it was a solvable problem and I solved it, but I did it without asking you, which means I made a decision about your life without your consent, which is a pattern Another stop. "Which is what I do. And I'm aware that it's what I do. And I'm telling you now instead of not telling you, which is the only thing I know how to offer that isn't just another version of the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. The thing moving through her was not simple. Gratitude and fury and something underneath both of them that was more complicated than either. Danny's number on the phone. The specific weight of it. Gone, apparently, while she'd been sitting in that house not knowing it was gone. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes." "At the time." "Yes." That was mine to deal with. "Yes." He said it each time without defense, which was either the most disarming thing he'd ever done or another form of control, and she was too tired to reliably tell the difference. "I know." She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He looked at her. "For solving the problem," she said. "Not for how you did it, but for—" She paused. "Danny doesn't know where I am or what any of this has been. He just knows his tuition got sorted and his sister is out of state dealing with a family thing, and he can go back to his structural analysis and call me on Sundays." She felt something in her chest ease, very slightly, that had been tight for 12 days. "That matters. Even the way you did it. It matters." "It shouldn't have been." "I know how it should have been," she said. "I'm telling you how it is. Those are different things, and both of them are true." He looked at her for a moment with that expression. The one she'd first seen in the diner, the door opening on a hinge he'd forgotten existed. "You do that," he said. "Hold two things at once without resolving them." "Most things don't resolve," she said. "They just become something you carry differently." He was quiet. Outside, the city continued. The work lights on battery power had dimmed to something almost warm. "What happens now?" she said. He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, not performing consideration, but actually doing it, which she'd come to recognize as one of the things about him that was genuinely different from the performance of it. "The arrangement with Aldrin needs to be formalized. That takes time and people I trust, which is a smaller group than it was 2 weeks ago." He paused. "The organization needs restructuring. The legitimate businesses Gavin didn't know I'd been working on for the past year, there are 7 of them at various stages. I need to finish that work. Remove the pieces that can't be cleaned." Another pause. "It's a year, maybe 18 months, of work that's different from what it's been. And then? And then it's something else." He looked at her. "Something I don't have a name for yet." She nodded. "And you," he said. "What happens to you?" She thought about Patty's, the fluorescent light above booth 4, the coffee maker dripping wrong, Gerald and his napkin costs, and the way the overnight shift felt at 3 in the morning when the last customer had gone and there was nothing to do but wipe down surfaces that were already clean. She thought about who she'd been when she walked in for that shift, and who she was sitting on this crate in this warehouse, and whether those were the same person or 2 people who happened to share a name and a face and a set of memories. "I don't know yet," she said. I haven't let myself think past the immediate problem for 12 days. She looked at her hands. "I need to see Danny. That's the first thing. Whatever else is next, that's first." "I know. I'm going to tell him something happened," she said. "Not everything, but something. He's 20 years old and he's not a child, and he deserves to know that his sister's life got complicated in ways that will take time to explain fully." She paused. "He'll have questions I won't be able to answer completely." "That's usually how it goes," Lucian said, "with people who matter." She looked at him. There was a quality to the moment that she recognized, the same quality that certain moments in the diner had, late nights when something real happened between 2 strangers over a cup of coffee that neither of them would remember separately, but both would carry. A realness. The kind that didn't ask to be named. "The first night," she said, "in the diner, before you told me your name. You said you were there because everyone around you lies or fears you or manipulates you." She paused. "What were you actually doing in a roadside diner at 11:15 in a rainstorm?" He was quiet for a moment. "Driving," he said. "I do that sometimes, when the house gets to a specific weight. I drive and I stop somewhere that has nothing to do with anything, and I sit for an hour." He looked at the floor. "It's the only thing I've found that approximates—" He stopped. "Quiet," she said. "Yes. And then I served you burnt coffee and called you predictable. And tore up $4,000. And tore up $4,000, she agreed. Something moved through his expression. Not the ghost of a smile, but the real thing, briefly, the actual version. And it changed his face in the way that authentic things change faces, removing several years and several layers of what the years had deposited. She'd seen versions of it. She hadn't seen that one before. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. And I want you to answer it the same way you asked me to answer, without managing it." He looked at her. "All right. Is it over?" she said. "Aldrin, Gavin, the men who came in last night, the network underneath all of it. Is this the end of the threat, or is this a pause in it?" He didn't answer immediately. He was doing the thing, actually calculating, not performing it, and she waited. "It's the end of this specific shape of it," he said. "There will be other shapes, there always are. But this one, Aldrin is satisfied for now, or satisfied enough. Gavin is outside the architecture. The men who came in last night were contractors, not loyalists. Without Gavin's access and Aldrin's backing, they're an inconvenience, not a threat." He paused. "For the next 6 months, the specific danger you've been living inside is reduced. After that, it depends on how quickly I can restructure." 6 months, she said, give or take. She nodded slowly, processed that. "I'm not going back to the diner," she said. It came out without premeditation, which meant it was true in the way that things are true before you've decided whether you're ready for them to be. "Whatever is next, it's not that. Not because it was beneath me, it never was, but because I'm—" She felt for the word. "I've been reorganized. By this. By all of it. I don't know yet what I reorganize into, but it's not a 9-hour overnight shift at Patty's. No, he said. It's not. That's not a commitment to anything, she said, looking at him, making sure he understood. I'm not telling you what I'm going toward. I'm telling you what I'm not going back to. I know the difference, he said. She believed him. They sat for another moment in the dimming light of the warehouse. The portable work lights were almost gone now, down to a last amber residue that made the space look very different from the harsh, flat illumination of an hour ago. Warmer, smaller, the darkness outside the circle of it absolute. She could hear Petra and Cord somewhere near the loading dock, movement without urgency. The brass lamp, Lucian said. From the second floor. The one you threw the first night. She'd almost forgotten about it. It felt like something from a different story. What about it? That was the thing, he said. That's when I knew. Knew what? That you weren't going to be manageable. He looked at her. I've had 100 people in various situations try to leverage an outcome. They all made the same calculation. What does this person want? How do I use that? You picked up a lamp and threw it because it was the right thing to do, regardless of what it cost you. That's not a calculation. That's a character. He said the last word the way you say something that's been in your head for a while and is being said out loud for the first time. I've been building a life around people who calculate, and I'd forgotten that character existed as a separate thing until you threw a lamp at someone's head. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not what I expected either, she said. What did you expect? Someone uncomplicated, she said. Fear is usually uncomplicated. The things people do from it are usually uncomplicated. She paused. Not. Is that good? It's inconvenient, she said. But yes. He looked at her with an expression she would spend a long time after this moment finding references for. Not in her experience of other people, but in her experience of herself, the way she felt standing in it. Seen was the closest word. The specific experience of being looked at by someone who isn't looking for anything from you, who isn't assessing or calculating or preparing a position, who is simply looking, seeing. She'd been the one who saw things for as long as she could remember. She was not used to being the one seen. She stood up from the crate, picked the gun up from the floor and held it out to Petra, who materialized from the edge of the space to take it. Straightened her jacket, the good jacket from the wardrobe, the one she'd taken this afternoon without thinking about whether taking things from his wardrobe meant something, which it did, which she'd decided to think about later. We should go, she said. Lucien stood. He was still carrying the damage of the night, the cut, the wrists, a stiffness in his left side that she'd noticed and hadn't commented on, and he wore it without comment, without performing either stoicism or suffering. Yes, he said. They walked toward the loading dock. Petra and Cord fell in without needing direction. The four of them in the warehouse moving toward the exit, the sounds of the car outside, the city's distant continued existence waiting to receive them. At the loading dock door, Evelyn stopped. She looked back at the warehouse, the upturned crates, the arrangement of a conversation that had turned itself into something other than what it had been designed to be. The last of the work lights, the space itself, large and cold and smelling of concrete, and the recent past. 12 days ago, she'd been wiping down a counter at Patty's, counting the flicker of a fluorescent light, listening to her brother's voice on the phone say a number that felt like the end of something. She'd been surviving in the specific, daily, relentless way she'd been surviving for years, not because she wanted to, but because she was the kind of person who kept going not from hope, exactly, but from something more stubborn than hope. The refusal to let the next thing be the thing that finally stopped her. She hadn't expected to be changed by a Mafia king who walked in out of a rainstorm. She hadn't expected to be changed by anything. Change felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But you didn't get to decide what changed you. You got to decide what you did with it. She turned away from the warehouse, walked through the door. Outside, the night air was cold and clear, the earlier cloud cover broken, and somewhere above the city the sky was doing what it did after storms, clarifying, the light returning to itself. She got in the car. Lucien got in the car. They drove back through the city without speaking, which was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said enough for one night and understood that some things settle better without language rushing them. The city moved past the windows. She watched it and thought about Danny and what she'd say when she called him tomorrow. Actually called him, with her own voice and her own words, and what his voice would sound like and whether she'd be able to keep her own level, and decided it didn't matter if she couldn't. Some things were allowed to be what they were. They reached the house at 8:47. The gates opened. The car pulled in. The damaged fence near the east gate had been worked on further in their absence. She could see the repair was mostly done, the structure back, functional, if not yet finished. The grounds were lit, men at the positions. The house itself, its stone and dark glass, catching the last of the night sky, solid in the way of things built to last past the events that happen inside them. She got out of the car. She stood on the gravel for a moment and felt the specific quality of standing still after long motion. The body still carrying the memory of the car, of the warehouse, of the corridor 2 nights before, and the garden before that, and the diner at the beginning of all of it. This whole compressed and unlikely sequence of events that had taken 12 days and felt like a different unit of time entirely. Lucian came around the car and stood near her, not beside her exactly. Near. "The cut," she said. "Kitchen, 10 minutes. I'll clean it." "You don't need to—" "I know I don't need to," she said. 10 minutes. He looked at her. Something in his face arranged itself into something that wasn't quite peace, but was the nearest available approximation of it in a face that had learned to do without peace for a very long time. 10 minutes, he agreed. She walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard him follow. His footsteps on the gravel, steady, the pace of someone who was not rushing but was not behind either. The house's lights were warm in the windows, and the door was held open by a staff member who said nothing, which was exactly right. She went inside. She didn't know what the next 6 months would look like. She didn't know what came after that, what shape she would take when all of this had settled, what she would look like to herself from the other side of the distance that was still ahead. She didn't know what to do with a man who had kidnapped her and trusted her and bled in her presence and said, "I need your help with the specific courage of someone for whom that sentence was the most dangerous thing they'd said in years." She knew Danny would graduate. She knew that the tuition was handled and the housing was handled, and he would call on Sunday and she would pick up. And her voice would be her voice, and his would be his, and none of what had happened would exist in that phone call. And all of it would anyway, underneath, the way everything you carry is under everything you do. She knew she was not the same person who had served burnt coffee at 11:15 on a Thursday. She knew that wasn't a loss. In the kitchen, she ran warm water over a clean cloth and turned to face the man sitting on the counter stool with dried blood on his face and marks on his wrists, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has learned, slowly, at great cost, over the course of 12 impossible days, that being watched is not the same as being threatened, and that the difference between the two is the thing he'd been unable to name until someone who tore up his money and threw a lamp at an assassin and walked into a warehouse with an unfired weapon had shown it to him in the only language that had ever gotten past his defenses. The language of a person who simply, completely, without calculation or agenda, told the truth. She pressed the cloth to the cut above his eye. He winced, held still. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. She cleaned it, carefully. The way you do things that matter when you've stopped pretending they don't. Outside, the city continued. The storm was over. The sky, slowly, was clearing itself of everything the night had left behind. And in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and clean water, two people who had cost each other more than either had bargained for sat inside the quiet aftermath of a story that had started with a rainstorm and a defiant waitress and a crime lord who had walked into the wrong diner on the right night, and began, slowly, without declaration, without a word about what it was or where it was going, to see what came next.